So what we're going to do then is talk about the next step. Remember, there are 4 stages to this consultative problem solving model. Problem identification, first stage, which we've talked about. The next stage is problem analysis. And there are really 2 components to problem analysis. The first is the analysis phase itself, which is where we look at potential skills, difficulties, or we conduct what's called a conditions analysis, where we're looking primarily at environmental factors that impact on behavior. For the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to assume that a skills analysis is not necessary. Keep in mind, though, that you may run into situations, particularly if we're dealing with academic or social skills deficits, where a skills analysis would be appropriate. And so what that means is that at this stage you would have some data that would suggest to you as a consultant that more evaluation of the student's skills in a particular area, academic, social, etc., needs to be conducted before designing any strategies, and it may actually lead you with that skills analysis to pinpointing the specific deficits academically or socially that the kid has that would lead then to some direct instruction or some other form of intervention related to those specific deficits. For our purposes right now, we're going to assume that there isn't a skills deficit in the cases we're working with, and that we're primarily looking at performance deficits where the skills are there, but the behaviors are not being performed at the required level for reasons that are most likely related to environmental factors. Okay? So that first part of the problem analysis phase then is to really look at those conditions, antecedent, consequent, sequential conditions, and come up with a preliminary hypothesis as to what's triggering the behavior and what might be the function of the behavior. And then that leads to the plan design phase, where you, as the consultant, provide some broad strategies as to what we should do. So, for example, if the data from the problem analysis phase indicated that behavior, let's go back to the case we were talking about in the PII, that, was it Jimmy? Yeah, Jimmy's behavior in the morning, the trigger for that is this assignment, the journal writing assignment, and that the primary function of that behavior, let's just keep it simple, is that he's doing it for teacher attention. Okay, so eventually the teacher comes around, talks to him, and so there's teacher attention as the function. So if that's the case, then you as a consultant state that you know what I think is triggering Jimmy's behavior is this assignment. What I think is helping to support him continuing to do that is the attention you're paying to him as a function of that. So what we need to think about is for a way for you as a teacher to provide him some attention when he's doing the right thing, when he's following through on the journal writing assignment. So you're kind of given like just kind of a general framework of what needs to be done from your point of view. So you're bringing in that expert power, you're bringing in that expertise, you're giving that general broad brush strategy. However, it's not totally prescriptive. You then go to the point where you're now going to talk about the specifics. What is that actually going to look like? What does that mean? I'm going to pay attention when he's doing the right thing. How is that going to get carried out? How are we going to do that? And that's where you enter a brainstorming phase of where both you and the consultee throw out ideas in terms of what are called plan tactics. So the specifics of how that's going to play out. And this is where you really want the consultee to be engaged with the process, to come up with as many ideas as she can to build some engagement in the process and also she's more likely to identify ways to do this that are going to be feasible and acceptable to her as the teacher. So again, you give the general plan strategy, then you collaboratively develop the plan tactics with the teacher. So there's a brainstorming phase of throwing out ideas for this, and then there's a collaborative decision-making between you and the consultee as to exactly what's going to happen when in terms of the plan. And then you finish this phase by reaffirming assessment, the need for assessment data to be collected to see if the intervention's working. Okay, so you work on the details of that, and maybe there's some additional assessment that's collected. All right, so with that plan design phase, you're coming up with a general strategy, you're collaboratively generating ideas in terms of the specifics, and then agreeing on what those specifics look like, and then talking about data collection beyond that point. The primary way that this is operationalized is through a problem analysis interview. So similar to what we did with the PII, we would do here in what's called a PAI, problem analysis interview. And there are several steps that we would take here. One is we would actually look at the data that were collected and establish whether there was enough data and that the data were informative in some way, that it was accurate of what we had agreed upon. So that adequacy of data, question mark, is do we have enough data to go on, and is it really what we had agreed on and telling us anything? If the answer is no to any of those questions, then you might need to suggest we need to continue collecting the data or collect it differently and more accurately, which harkens back to the need to check in during that data collection phase early on and make sure that there aren't problems so you can circumvent the need to do that, because as you might imagine, consultees aren't really thrilled when you start talking about collecting more data. But the fact of the matter is, unless you have adequate data, you really can't proceed. The data are best viewed in graphic form. And I have a couple of examples here that actually we're going to use as the case example in a few minutes, where you're plotting the data across time, and you're looking for a pattern, you're looking for consistency, and seeing how much it differs from the first goal that was identified in the PII. So in other words, we're going to look at, and let me just use these data as an example. This isn't Jimmy's case. This is the other case example that we're going to walk through. But let's say that in the PII, we wanted the number of times off task for this student our goal was for this to be only 3 times per class period. And our data suggest that currently, over the course of a week, we have an average of about 10 off-task events per period. So what we then talk to the consultee about is this discrepancy between our desired level of 3 and the current level of 10, is that a big enough difference? Is that a big enough gap that you would consider it a problem? Now, we could sit back and say, oh yeah, obviously that's a problem. Or conversely, if it's really tiny, we might say, well, it's really not that big of a deal. But we're not the ones with the problem. Okay? It is the teacher in that classroom that has to either perceive the problem or not perceive the problem. And so we're checking in, is this discrepancy still of concern to you? Now that we have some data, do you agree that this is still a problem? And if the answer is no, there isn't, then essentially you're done at this point, unless you've got to go and advocate. If you don't agree, that you think, oh, well, there is a problem, we need to do something about it, then you've got to kind of regroup in terms of how you're going to attack that. But from the point of view of this model, if the consultee doesn't view this as a problem, then you're done. That doesn't happen very often, as you might imagine. Usually that there's not too much of a disagreement as to whether there's a problem or not. But again, I want to go back from the point of view of this model. It's this arrow here, this gap, That's the problem. How big is that gap? And that's where the perception of the problem lies, that discrepancy between current performance and desired performance. So we go back and see, is that a problem? And then we may even revise the goal. Given those data, maybe 3 isn't a reasonable goal right away. If we're already averaging around 10, and in some cases we're going up to 15, maybe a more reasonable goal is going to be 5 or something, or 7 as an initial goal. And so our job as a consultant is maybe to guide that. Given what we've seen here, do you really think 3 is something realistic to shoot for right away, or might an intermediate goal be more appropriate? And so you get an agreement on that, and you move on to the conditions analysis. I have the question mark here, need for skills analysis, just as a reminder that if there are data to suggest that there's a skill deficit that's impacting on the particular behavior, then you need to go in that skills analysis direction and nail down where those deficits lie. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we're not going in that direction. We're assuming that it's not a skills issue, that it's a performance issue, and so we move on to conditions analysis. Now, some of the same questions that we asked during the PII, but now we have more information. So now we get really more specific. What were the triggers? What were the antecedent conditions during the baseline data collection? So go back to the graph up here in terms of off-task behavior. What were the antecedent conditions prior to these off-task events? What was happening most often to trigger these? And maybe we even have asked them during the problem identification phase to take some note of that. So maybe as we asked for these data to be collected in terms of frequency, maybe we also asked them to just jot down, if you notice particular triggers, particular things that are happening beforehand, jot those down so we have some information on that. And so you would refer back to that in terms of, okay, what during this week appeared to be triggering the off-task behavior, and then what appeared to be following that? What were the consequent conditions? What did you do as the teacher when the child went off task? What did other students do? Were there any other things that happened as a function of the child going off task? Anything else that happened in the environment? Did they eventually get their work done? Okay, so you want to get at teacher attention, peer attention, escape. You want to ask questions that explore each of those possibilities. And the other thing, of course, is sequential conditions. Is there a particular time of the day when these behaviors are more likely to occur, a particular day of the week? For example, if we look at the data, this is kind of jumping ahead to our case example, but that's okay. What's different about Monday versus Wednesday? Why was the student only a third of the level of off task on Monday versus Wednesday? And Wednesday in particular stands out as a high day for off task behavior. Why is that? Were there particular things happening there? Were there particular assignments being given? Did we have a substitute teacher in the classroom? I mean, what was going on there? And conversely, what was going on Monday that things were appreciably better? So we're using the data to look at the sequential conditions as well as antecedent and consequent conditions. Yes?
Question. So let's say that at the first PII, we decided that after the first process, no? We decided that we're going to reduce from 15 to 7.
Okay.
And after the teacher is comfortable and it's at 7, now he wants to go to 3.
Yes.
Do we start over from the PII, or can we start from the analysis?
That's a good question. And the answer is somewhat weaselish, and that is it depends. What I would always do in that kind of situation, and that's a fairly frequent thing where we're getting tentative goals or initial goals and then moving forward, is to check back in that the triggers are the same, consequent conditions are the same, sequential conditions are the same. In other words, things haven't really changed other than the fact that we've intervened our intervention's been effective and brought it down to a certain level. In that case, what we would talk about is we'd go really right to the analysis phase of, okay, what's the next goal and how are we going to bring that about? Are we going to make the intervention more intensive? How are we going to bring that to happen? So we're not necessarily going back and redefining the problem or looking in depth at the antecedent and consequent sequential conditions. We're affirming that that's still the case, and then we're going right to analysis. That's the most common thing. The other thing that could happen is things could change, in which case you would need to go back in part to the beginning. So it really depends. So that's the conditions analysis. The other part of the interview deals with the plan design. And as I mentioned to you, the segue here between the conditions analysis and the development of the plan is for you as a consultant to summarize what we know about the behavior, in particular the triggers and the potential function. And I realize this isn't a full-blown functional behavioral assessment. You would probably do other things in terms of collecting data to really nail down function. But in the context of this model, what you're doing is you're using the data that were collected and the interview information to come up with a tentative hypothesis as to the triggers and the potential functions of that behavior. And you summarize that without using that jargon, of course, but putting it in everyday language that what seems to be setting the kid off is this and this appears to be the function of the behavior, and therefore what we need to do is the following. So you give the general plan strategy, and then you brainstorm the tactics, that is the particular ways that this is going to get enacted. So for example, a general plan strategy might be, we need to implement a point system of some kind, a reward system, where the student is going to get some kind of a payoff or reinforcement for doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, so you've set that context. And now you're collaboratively working with the teacher to design what's that going to look like. Are we going to use points? Are we going to use poker chips? Are we going to use stickers? What part of the day are we going to do it? Who's going to do it? How long are we going to do it? All those kinds of things you're going to engage with the consultee in terms of working all that out. And then the last two pieces are we reaffirm the need to continue the data collection so that we know whether the plan works or not and what adjustments we need to make. And then we make arrangements to contact the consultee during that plan implementation. And in particular, we want to come in and observe the plan being implemented and give any feedback we might need if things aren't going the right way or aren't being done the way that it was agreed upon. And also to answer any questions or deal with any problems that come up. General idea of connecting conditions to intervention plans is kind of summarized in this table, really focused on behavioral interventions, as you might imagine, given that this is a behavioral consultation model. So what you have in the left-hand column is what the goal is. Is the goal to increase behavior? In the case of work completion, that would be, usually our goal is to increase behavior. In the case of off-task behavior, or disruptive behavior, we're looking to reduce it, or maybe we're looking to maintain the behavior at a certain level. Okay, so there's three different possibilities there, and then what we need to consider is each of the conditions: antecedent conditions, consequent conditions, and sequential conditions. So, for example, if we want to increase a behavior and use an antecedent, changing the antecedent conditions in some way, one possibility is to break a task into smaller parts and break it down into smaller units and focus on one unit at a time so that we're building that behavior up in that way. On the other hand, if we look at consequent conditions and we want to increase behavior, usually we're dealing with a positive reinforcement situation. By the way, negative reinforcer is not punishment. Negative reinforcement is what? Anybody know the definition of that? Yes.
I mean, I would say just an example is taking away something that is reinforcing to them. So maybe a positive reinforcement and taking that away.
Not quite. That's actually punishment. That's response cost So like, for example, if you gave them a token as a positive reinforcer for an appropriate behavior, and you remove that contingent on inappropriate behavior, you are punishing. That is response cost. That's not negative reinforcement. This is one of the hardest concepts for people to understand, negative reinforcement.
I think it's what maintains the inappropriate behavior, whether it's the peer's attention that he's getting when he's misbehaving, anything that maintains that, the behavior you want to change.
And removing that?
No, I'm just saying that if it's a consequence,
Yes.
and it's a negative reinforcer, he's
Yes.
getting something for the inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, actually, that's still positive reinforcement. Because, see, here's the thing. Here's the thing that screws you up in terms of this concept. Is positive and negative doesn't refer to the behavior, and it doesn't necessarily refer to the consequence. It's referring to the whether you're trying to increase a behavior or decrease a behavior. Excuse me. I'm getting confused. It's referring to whether you're introducing the stimulus or removing the stimulus. So a positive reinforcer is a stimulus that you present, okay, to the person to increase behavior. So if you're on task, I come over and give you praise. That is presumably a positive reinforcer. That's going to increase the probability that she's going to be on task. So I'm introducing the stimulus. Negative reinforcer would be removing an aversive stimulus, removing that stimulus so that behavior would increase. Okay? Yes?
Okay, suppose you have a class that the whole class has been misbehaving for the whole day. And then at the end of the day, you have a pizza party for the class. Would that be negative reinforcement?
No, that's positive reinforcement because you're introducing the pizza party as a reinforcement for behavior you want to increase. Okay? Negative reinforcement would be, an example, would be you've got some work done on your assignment, your written assignment, and now we remove that assignment, you get a break. Okay? We've taken that, presumably that aversive stimulus away periodically, shortly, temporarily, as a reinforcer. Okay? You've now escaped that aversive stimulus for a short period of time as a contingent on the fact that you've got some work done. Now we'll reintroduce it, you've got to get some more work done, and then we'll remove it. Okay, we don't use negative reinforcement all that frequently, but it is something that could potentially be used to increase behavior. But the idea is the negative part of that definition is referring to the fact that you're removing something. Not that you're impacting negative behavior or that the stimulus is necessarily negative, but you're removing it from the equation. Yes?
So would that be a scenario whereby everyone is sitting doing math? And at the teacher's own volition, they go and they take the math away and they say, okay, we've got...
You got a break. Everybody gets a break.
Exactly. And then they reintroduce the math for continuation.
Yes, and presumably, as a function, you've reinforced the removal of that task to give them a break has been reinforcing their effort. Okay, they've been putting good effort in, so contingent on that, we're removing that task for a period of time. And presumably, the next time we introduce that task, they're going to be more likely to engage with it because we've reinforced that.
Okay, so that you can do that at intermittent times.
Sure.
So thus increasing the length of time that they're on task.
Sure, you could do that. Just like you could have a schedule for positive reinforcement, how frequently you're giving tokens or points. You can have a schedule for negative reinforcement, how frequently you're removing the aversive stimulus and giving them a break. It's not something we usually use all that often, but it's not the same thing as punishment. Okay? Punishment, actually, there is both positive punishment and negative punishment, believe it or not. Positive punishment is introducing an aversive stimulus contingent on an inappropriate behavior. So, in harsh terms, spanking or, physical punishment, that's positive punishment, ironically, because you're introducing a stimulus, in this case, physical contact. Negative punishment would be removing something positive as a function of inappropriate behavior. Response cost is an example of negative punishment because you're removing the stimulus to try to reduce off-task behavior. Hopefully I'm not further confusing you by going in this direction. Yes?
So basically, the word negative doesn't really mean what we used to, but putting or taking out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Positive is introducing, negative is removing. And reinforcement is trying to increase behavior, punishment is trying to decrease behavior. So you can have any combination of four possibilities. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement to increase behavior. Positive punishment, negative punishment to decrease behavior. Okay, this isn't really critical for us to get this terminology down, so hopefully I haven't totally confused you here, but the important thing is that negative reinforcement is not punishment. Okay, it is removing something to try to increase behavior. Yes?
I see a lot in classrooms that when the students are misbehaving, okay, everybody take a piece of paper, we're doing a test now, or a quiz. Then that will be
Positive punishment. Yes. Positive punishment. You're introducing the test in order to reduce inappropriate behavior or whatever, reduce whatever's going on. The probability in the future that they will do that again. All right, so anyway, we can manipulate, the point is on this table is we can manipulate the conditions in order to increase, decrease, or maintain behavior. All right, and again, it's primarily from a behavioral perspective in the context of this model. Let's walk through an example of a problem analysis interview. We have our second case example on your handout. Lisa was kind enough to be our first actress in terms of our case example, did a great job, and I'm looking for another volunteer to do an equally fine job here as a consultee. Okay, so before we go through the interview, just to go through the example here a little bit, we have Anna, who's a fourth grade general education teacher, and the client, the student that we're trying to work with here is Amy, a 9-year-old girl with ADHD combined type. You can read through there in terms of the target behaviors, fairly common issues here. Disruptive off-task behavior, she's talking out loud without permission, she's disturbing classmates, she's not completing her assigned seat work in a consistent fashion. And through the PII, assume that the PII has already occurred. So we've met each other before, we've gone through the PII, you've collected some data. So during the PII, we learned that Amy is most likely to engage in these behaviors when she's asked to complete written work independently. Okay? We also have established that there aren't real big questions about her cognitive skills, and her achievement, her tested achievement is on grade level. So we don't have a skills deficit here, at least there's not any indicator of a skills problem. It's a performance problem in terms of exhibiting those skills on a regular basis in the day-to-day classroom. We set a goal, we mutually set a goal during the PII of reducing her off-task behavior to 3 times per 30-minute period. She guesstimated that that would be a reasonable goal prior to any data collection. Okay? She also set a goal for her work completion. So we honed down the 2 problems to be off-task disruptive behavior, which we operationalized in that previous paragraph, talking without permission, talking to classmates, and so forth. Okay, that's the off-task disruptive behavior. And the other problem that we identified that we wanted to look at was work completion. And she set a goal initially at the PII of 85% of the work completed on average. And of course, these are related. You know, the off-task behavior obviously impacts on percentage of work completed, but we felt during the PII that it was necessary to look at both behaviors. So between the PII and the PAI, she collected data on both of these behaviors. She took some sampling of the frequency of off-task disruptive behavior during 30-minute periods, and we did that for a week. and she did the same for seat work completion, what percentage was done. Okay? So we have that. Everything else we can make up. And, but we have that to work with, so we know what the two problems we're focused on. You've got the data, you're bringing them to me, and we're going to walk through the interview at this point. Okay, we're going to start here in terms of looking at the data. All right? So that's the first part of the interview. Okay. Hello, Anna. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing great.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you. I know you were really anxious to get going and work on Amy's difficulties with her off-task behavior and her work completion, and I appreciated that you collected some data so we could really get a handle on where things are at right now for both of those things.
Great.
And did you have any problems in terms of getting that information, getting those data?
Well, at first it was a bit challenging, but then I figured out a way that I would do it, and it wasn't too bad.
Good. Well, again, I appreciate that, and hopefully you'll see it as being worth it so that we have some idea of where we're at and then eventually whether our plans work or not. Good. So I also appreciate the fact that, well, actually, if I take the data from you, I'll quickly graph it. So I would do that, graph it, and lo and behold, here are two graphs. Okay? And so let's take a look at, it looks like you, and I'm not going to turn to that. I'm going to pretend it's on a page here, but it's up there. So it looks like you collect the data every day for the week, like we agreed upon, and it looks like you have some good information about the two behaviors that we're honing in on, the off-task disruptive behavior of talking with her classmates and talking aloud without permission, and then also what percentage of work she was getting done. And do you think that this is an accurate representation of a typical week for Amy? Anything that was unusual about this week that might have affected how the data looked?
No, it is like that. In fact, I know Amy. She's been here since kindergarten. I have talked to other teachers, and it is always like that. Every year, every teacher, they always have that problem. She just won't focus. She just can't sit still and do her work.
Okay, so this is typical and an obviously ongoing problem. It's not a new problem.
And a couple of the kids that she has the problem talking to, they've been with her throughout the years. So I think that could be too, that they're really bonded.
Sure. Yeah, and maybe that's getting in the way a little bit. Okay. Well, if we look at the data now that we've graphed it, if we look at the off-task behavior, it looks like on average we're looking at about 10 off-task events per 30 minutes from your data. And would you agree that that's kind of the average? I'm just kind of pretend that I'm showing this on here, but it's up there.
Right.
And so, and you had indicated that initially, last time we met, a week or two ago, that you were looking for this frequency to be about 3 per 30 minutes. In other words, 3 off-task events per 30 minutes.
30 minutes. Yeah, that would be great if we could go straight down from 10 to 3.
10 to 3.
But I'm willing to work with you if you think that's a bit, like, I'm asking for too much.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's your classroom, so we can talk about that. But where we can start, though, is by looking at, okay, that there's a difference. There appears to be a difference of where she's at right now, which is about 10 per 30 minutes, versus where you want her to be in terms of 3. So that difference of basically 7 events per 30 minutes, do you see that as a problem, that difference of 7? Is that a big enough issue that you think is a problem that we need to continue to work on?
Definitely an issue, because we're also looking at possibility of retention now, so we really need to get her on track.
Okay, so that gap is big in terms of that. And then let's look also at the work completion. You had set as a goal 85% of, we wanted to get about 85% of her work done, and it looks like over the course of the week that it was about 50% of the work was getting done. Some days a little better than others, but about 50% of the work was getting done.
Yes, but I have to be on top of her, and I'm really neglecting other students because I keep focusing on her and going back to talk to her. So I would like not only to see the 85%, but she needs to be a little more independent. I can't just focus on her. I have 22 other students in my class.
Okay.
21, I'm sorry.
All right. Well, good. Yeah. So we want her to be doing it truly independently, and 85% of that work being done. So again, we have 50% versus 85%, so a gap of 35%. would we agree that that's a problem, that difference?
That's definitely-
That's a big enough difference that we feel like we need to continue to address
That
that.
will impact her grade greatly, so we really need to get that going.
Great. Okay, so we have agreement that there's a problem here, both in terms of the off-task disruptive behavior and the work completion. And let's just revisit the goals here for a minute, the 10 to the 3. Pretty big gap there. Would it be possible to look at maybe an initial goal that's somewhere between 3 and 10? That might be more realistic, at least in terms of some initial plans.
Well, I'm willing to work with you. You tell me. Because, like I said, it's something that's been going on for quite some time. So maybe it is a pretty high expectation to drop that
Right.
down to 3. So I'm willing to work on it, maybe get to a 5.
Okay, so maybe 5 is an initial goal, and then we could work from there. Okay, how about with the work completion? Do we want to stick with 85%? Is that the 50 to 85 also a big jump there? What do you think about that?
You know, I was just thinking maybe we can lower that percentage as well, as long as you be willing to also talk to the parents so that she can also complete homework, because it's not just the classwork, it's the homework that's not getting done.
Sure.
So that number I'm willing to work if we can get the parents to get the homework done as well.
Well, and that's reasonable, and we may want to bring the parents into the conversation that we're having in terms of, particularly if we hit on some strategies that work well in school, maybe there are some things that they could be doing at home to support the homework. But so you're saying that maybe we drop the 85 as a goal to what?
To a 75?
75, okay, good. All right, so we've revised our goals to 5 off-task events per 30 minutes as a goal, and 75% work completion,
That'd be good.
right? Good. Let's stop here. Questions, comments on any of this? Yes?
I think it would be important to know what's going on that Wednesday, because it's affecting both behavior.
Yeah, we're gonna get to the conditions analysis, and that's where I would explore that. Right now, all I'm trying to establish is, A, do we have enough data to work with, which clearly we do, and B, is there a discrepancy in terms of where she wants the behavior to be versus where it is at? Clearly, that's the case. And then whether she wants to revise the goals based on the data. So that's where we've got so far. But you're absolutely right. With the conditions analysis, we're going to have to explore that.
And also, would you revise it to that 75%? Because on Monday, she's able to do 75%. So wouldn't you want just a little more, because she is capable of doing 75?
Yeah, we had 1 day out of 5 with 75. Remember, too, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, is sometimes it's helpful to set goals right at their capability level so that we hook them into the system, assuming might be going in a motivational direction. I'm not sure that that's what we're going to do, but probably. And so it may be that setting that goal at 75 will ensure instant success, or not instant, but pretty quickly. And that might be a good thing to happen, and then we could build the goal up from there. But certainly if we had a bunch of 75s up here, we might question that. Of course, the average would be higher then too. But any other questions, comments so far? So we've established the first piece of this, that we've got enough data, there is a problem, and we've revised the goal. So now we want to do the conditions analysis. Again, we're going to revisit those conditions. Okay, so again, I appreciate you getting all that data. It's really helpful, and there's some interesting, we'll talk about kind of the patterns across the days, because it's kind of interesting. But first, let's think about what, with her off-task disruptive behavior, were you able to notice what appeared to be triggering that? What appeared to be happening right before her off-task disruptive
So as
behavior?
you know, my biggest problem is on Wednesdays, and that's when they have PE, right before we sit for that particular class, and that's when I noticed that she comes back really agitated.
Okay.
She has difficulty focusing, and she wants to talk all the time. Usually it's right after PE.
Okay, so on Wednesdays, when she has PE, that's where it's particularly prominent, the trigger or things that are happening before she's highly active physically, and now coming in and transitioning to having to sit and quietly work on work. Okay, and that's hard for transition for her. How about on the other days, though, in terms of what is happening, and maybe even on Wednesday, too, what's happening right before the off-task behavior occurs?
Well, the other days, I gotta tell you something one thing that she's a bit of a boy crazy. So usually those conversations is surrounding, like, it's about crushes and boys and boyfriend. So I noticed that whenever we move, because they have to go to their specials, they actually walk all the way to the music teacher. And that's when they have the opportunity. I guess the conversation gets started in the hallway, and they just can't put a stop to it when they walk in a classroom.
Okay.
It's kind of like they're all excited. They want to talk about the stuff.
So you're typically assigning work right when they're coming in from a transition then? Okay. And then the work itself, when you make that assignment to her and give her some work to do, is that right before she starts becoming disruptive as well?
Yes, she definitely has, whenever we say, let's do some work, everybody get your books, and that's when she starts chit-chatting and trying anything to get her out of focus, and she's not doing the work anymore. She's looking back and talking to the friend. And definitely whenever they have to sit and do work, that's when, then she remembers she had to tell something really important. Sometimes she even screams across the room calling her other friend.
Okay. So that she's coming in, I understand that the transition, she's already kind of talking and excited about boys or whatever the discussions are, or on some days very physically active coming in from PE, and so she's already kind of energized. But you also are saying that right before she starts to become disruptive and doesn't get her work done is you're giving her the assignment. Okay. And then what happens at that point? She starts doing these things, talking out or being loud or whatever, and what do you do at that point?
Well, I go to her desk and I try nicely to ask her to please focus. I need her, and we talk about a million times. I have approached her after class and asked her to please help me out here because we look at her grades and we look at some stuff that she had not completed before. And I tried to talk to her about consequences, but it kind of goes here and out here. And the next day she's screaming across again and talking to the kids.
So
a lot of drama too. A lot of drama.
It's a lot of emotion. So when you go and talk to her and she's doing this, what her reaction is? What does she respond? Does she say anything? Does she do anything? What does she do?
She obviously she likes the attention, and then sometimes she even starts trying to tell me what she wants to tell her friends, and I try to stop her because I don't want to go there. Let's focus on the lesson. And she's good. Sometimes I notice a bit of an attitude, but most of the time she's good.
Good meaning then she'll go and do the work?
Yeah, she'll go and do the work for a few minutes now.
And then she's off again?
Off again.
Okay. So she tries to get you in a conversation. She's excited to have the opportunity to talk to you, but eventually she will go back.
It's almost
to
like
work.
she tries to make me feel sorry for her because she has some crush and the guy's not talking to her and her life is miserable. Me is all about me.
Right.
And she's desperate for people to listen to the drama in her life.
Right. And so you're trying to dissuade her from that, get her back onto the task, and she does that for a little while, and then she starts to go off task again.
Yeah, and after she wants to come to see you, but I tell her, you need to finish your work first. Then you can go see your counselor.
Okay, good. And what do the other kids do when she's trying to talk to them or she's loudly disrupting the class? What do the other kids do?
Well, I have like I said, the little group that's been following her for a few years now, the little group of drama queens. They love the interaction. They kind of want to pay attention to her. But when they see that I'm talking to her, then they all like start focusing and doing the work. But if it's not for me going there right now, right at the time and trying to stop, they engage.
So they'll they'll get in a conversation with her. They'll keep fooling around with her. Okay. And then you said we have some data to show that she doesn't get the work done. So she's getting out of some of the work anyway. She's not getting it all done.
Homework is an issue too, as you know.
Right. And we're going to deal with that separately. But let's focus on what's right there happening in the classroom right now, because you're going to have more control over that. I mean, homework involves obviously the parents as well. And as I said to you before, maybe we bring them into this process later on. But right now, let's just focus on what's there right in front of you in the classwork. And who knows, maybe that'll have some impact on the homework. I don't know.
You should check what's happening at home. I think her mom is a stripper.
Okay.
So that could be,
Yeah. Yeah, you never know what that could do. Yeah, so I do need to follow up on that. But in terms of what we can focus on here, regardless of what the parents are doing, we can think about, all right, what are some things that we can be doing in the classroom to help her? And we're going to get to that in a minute. What I'm curious about is that, and you've given me some clues in terms of this, that the Wednesday, she didn't get a lot of work done on Wednesday, only 25% of her work done, and she had a lot of off-task behavior. And you're attributing that primarily because she's coming from PE class, she's highly active and energized. And is there anything else that's different about Wednesday? Anything different about the kind of work that you're assigning or other expectations that are happening there?
I think Wednesday is early release day for them too, so it's the worst day. The kids are really not like in school mode. It's almost like today is a fun day. Let's just go and enjoy our PE time and chit chat all day. It's hard to get them to focus. Not only her, but I have a difficulty with the rest of the class.
Okay, so the rest of the class on Wednesday is also not settling down.
Right.
And so is it possible that the fact that other classmates are not settling down as readily could be triggering for her to be more disruptive?
Now that you mention it, could be.
Okay, so that's something that maybe we think about. Now, what about on Monday? Monday seemed to be a pretty good day. She didn't have a lot of off-task events. She got 75% of her work done. What was different about that? Anything different about that day in terms of what was happening before or after her behavior, or what kind of assignments you were giving, or anything along those lines?
I don't know, maybe because she just got back to school after the weekend and she had all the time to talk with her friends over the weekend, and by the time it's the middle of the week, she's falling behind on the gossiping.
Okay.
That's my guess.
Okay.
But Monday, she's kind of, okay, we're just starting here, and as the week progresses, she just gets more.
Okay, so nothing in particular in the classroom itself that's different, or the types of assignments you give, or what you say to her, do with her on that Monday is no different than the other days?
Not really.
Okay, all right. Okay, so it looks like to me that we have a situation here where we've agreed there's definitely a discrepancy between where we want her and where she's at right now, and that we have a couple of different things that might be triggering her disruptive behavior, and the fact that she's not getting her work done. The most obvious trigger is you're giving her work to do, obviously sets her off. But also, you're saying that there may be the physical activity on Wednesdays that kind of energizing her, as well as the fact that she's already been engaged in some conversations with her friends, and it's hard for her to transition out of that into the work mode. So we have multiple potential triggers there. And it appears that what she's getting out of this is a couple of things, in terms of she's not getting all her work done, so she's kind of avoiding the work a little bit. And the other is she's getting some attention from you and her classmates. I realize that you try to shut that down pretty quickly, but she's trying to engage you in a conversation and engage her friends in conversations, and that happens. It's going on for at least a period of time, so she's getting something out of that.
Can I send her to you when she starts?
I don't know that, see, if you send her to me in terms of that, she's getting out of her work at that point.
That's what I have been telling her.
And,
See your counselor later, and then later, guess what? Oh, it's okay, I don't need to talk to the counselor anymore.
Right. So, which tells you that it may not be as pressing of an issue that needs your immediate attention, or my immediate attention for that matter. So I don't think we would need to do that in this case, especially since that might actually tie into her not getting her work done. It might actually be rewarding for her in terms of getting out of her work, which is not where we want to go. We want to get up to getting more work done. So it seems like there's multiple things that we might be thinking about in terms of some strategies based on this. I'm going to stop here before we go into the strategy. Questions, comments? Any of you guys have ideas or questions about what's happened? Anything else I should be asking that I didn't ask, or asked differently? We have a pretty good idea. I mean, granted, this is not a full-blown FBA. We know that. But we have some data that she collected, and we have some interview responses that are giving us some ideas. So we have some idea of what this is probably a multiple function situation, where the student is getting a lot of gains out of not doing her work and being off task. She's getting teacher attention, she's getting peer attention, and at least for a period of time, she's getting out of the work. So So there's a number of different directions we could take here. So any comments, questions before we move to the next piece? Yes.
If the data was taken for, say, 3 weeks, I guess I would ask the teacher to describe what Monday looked like.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's consistent that Monday, the child is performing, and then except for on Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, her behavior or the activities are consistent.
Mm-hmm.
You know what triggers Wednesday, but there is a trigger for Monday. So I would definitely go back, because maybe Monday, you all do a role play. You said she's a drama queen, so maybe she gets the opportunity to act out because it's reading, as opposed to it being math, science, social studies, or whatever else, where she doesn't have that. So I would inquire of the teacher.
Well, he did ask me, but since I'm making stuff up.
No, but I'm just saying, I recognize, no, it's not you that I'm responding to, but I'm just saying in general, that could be the response of teachers, or even clinicians, when we ask them, what are you doing? But if you have the data, it's something that is totally oblivious to them, but it's not until you look at the data that an outsider, it's like the outsider looking in, we can focus in on something and say, hey, but something is happening.
And you make a good point. If we had more time for baseline data collection, we could pick up on, this could be an aberration, this Monday business, or it could be a consistent pattern. Same thing for Wednesday. She's surmising that the PE is the business on Wednesday. That may or may not be true. And you're right, if we don't have multiple weeks and multiple data points, we can't really discern that. But based on what we have right now, we can't really nail down. She's not able to nail down for me what's different about Monday. Maybe once we start intervening and we still see a pattern there, we can get at that. Even with intervention, maybe Mondays are going to be even better, and so then the rest of the days, and so we'll still be able to explore that down the line. Yes?
Jimmy, the boy she has a crush on?
They should get together, right?
This week.
Yeah, maybe that's a good match. So for the interest of simplicity, in terms of, because we got about 45 minutes left, a little less than 45 minutes left, not for the interview, but for the whole thing. I don't want to scare you with that. So I'm just gonna focus on teacher attention as the piece here to lead into the intervention strategies, okay, just for the sake of argument, or not argument, but the sake of going through this. But keep in mind that if we have multiple functions, we could be going a number of different directions here in terms of strategies, but I'm just gonna try to keep it simple, okay? All right, so it seems like part of what Amy's getting out of this process is she's getting some attention from you, and she's getting that attention when she's off task. And it seems to me that maybe we should come up with some strategies, some ways where she can get attention from you, briefly, for doing the right thing, for getting her work done, for being on task. And so what I'd like us to do is just kind of brainstorm some possibilities of how we might set up a situation where she's not getting a lot of attention from you when she's off task and not getting her work done, but she is getting attention from you when she's getting her work done and she's on task.
Ooh, that's hard. Okay, you tell me, how do I do this?
Well, I'm looking for, how do you think that might play out? How could we do that specifically?
Well, because here's the problem. Once you start getting the attention from other students, obviously I get irritated. And my first gut reaction is just to stop,
Right.
shut up.
Right.
Of course, that's not how I handle, but I don't know, I need to stop that before I can try to do something else. So let's see, positive, maybe I can get her to help me with passing papers, or she can be, I can give her some kind of job.
Okay, and we're just brainstorming now, so we're just, any idea is a good idea. So that's one potentially a good idea, so we're going to throw that in there. Another possibility, kind of similar to that, is maybe you're doing something ahead of time. When you're giving the assignment out, maybe there's something where you're reminding her that you want her to stay, on task to get the work done as much as she can get done. And if she gets a certain amount of work done, that you'll spend a couple minutes with her talking separately. Maybe not necessarily right away, but at some point during the day, you can have a private conversation with her. Any other ideas?
Well, that sounds good. Well, I know they like I used to bring more candy and things like that to give it to them whenever they say something nice, we'll do this, do the right thing in our own little classroom. So maybe I can bring that back, because that used to work pretty good. The kids get really excited whenever little thing that you give it to them. So maybe I can get some incentives,
Yep, okay,
candy or
okay,
little toys.
okay, that's good. And let's, just for the sake of time, we might go on with this in terms of generating some ideas, and then we would try to select them mutually. And let's say, for the sake of time, we've selected initially a couple strategies, the first two. So the idea of you having her help to give out the assignment, so she's working with you, she's getting a little bit of your attention and actually peers' attention by handing out the assignment. And then if she gets a certain amount of work done, you're setting a goal for that, then she's able to have a conversation with you after that. So let's assume we've nailed it down to those two to start with. So if we have, we're agreed on what we're going to try at first. I guess the question is, when do you want to start trying to do this? We ready to start this tomorrow, or?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, just so we walk through it, what'll happen is when an assignment is going to be given out, you'll have her help to hand that out to her classmates, and then you'll remind her that if she gets 75% of the work done, and maybe you need to work, well, she's probably can understand 75%, right? But so if she gets 75% of that work done, then she's able to have a conversation with you for a couple minutes.
Right.
When would that conversation take place? Would it be right after that assignment? Would it be later in the day? When would you do that?
It'll be later in the day.
Later in the
When
day.
I dismiss the students, she can stay a couple minutes afterwards and we can
Okay,
help.
so you remind her of that.
Right.
And you're going to start that tomorrow.
Yes.
And what I'd like to do, if possible, would be to come by maybe the next day, just come in for part of the time just to see how that's working out and see if you have any questions or any problems with that. Would that be okay?
That'd be great.
And maybe we could try this out for 2 weeks.
Okay.
Would that be enough time to try it out? And could you continue to collect the same data that you collected for me the last week or so?
Definitely. But since my major problem is on Wednesday and today's Thursday,
Mm-hmm.
well, yeah, let's give it a couple Wednesdays.
Okay, so let's go. Yeah, let's go for a couple weeks beyond that. So let's meet again. How about like 2 weeks from tomorrow?
Perfect.
We meet and we go over the data that you have. So you collect data on the number of off-task events, like you're doing, and then what percentage of the work she's getting done.
Okay.
Okay? And then if you have questions or problems that come up, you know how to get in touch with me. And but otherwise, I'll stop in day after tomorrow. Although this is a Thursday, so I wouldn't be stopping in a Saturday, but for the sake of argument, I'd come in like the second day you're doing this,
Okay.
and then we'll meet again in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good.
Good luck.
I'm excited.
Thanks. Yeah, let's hopefully
Everything's gonna
things will work out. Yeah. Okay. Good. Great. Oh, yeah. Great job, Anna. So there's 2 more stages to the model, and these will go quicker. We don't have interviews to go through on these, but the third stage is the actual plan implementation or treatment implementation, and there are 2 pieces to this: preparing for implementation. So assigning roles, who's going to do what. Now, in the case of this particular situation that Anna and I just did, the strategies were pretty straightforward. There aren't a lot of particular roles to play, but let's say, for example, we brought in peer tutoring as a piece. Then we would need to know, who's going to train the peers in the peer tutoring strategy. Would I come in as the consultant and train the class, or would Anna train the class? So that kind of thing. We work out the roles in terms of this. But this was a pretty clear example where the teacher is playing a primary role in terms of implementing the interventions. But if we have different mediation agents, as we talked about yesterday, then it gets a little more complex in terms of whose role is what. Okay, but for a teacher-mediated intervention like this, it's pretty straightforward. Any materials that we need, usually the consultant has to go find those materials. A lot of times that's your role. So, for example, if we're going to do peer tutoring or using computer software, or other things along those lines, it would be our job to try to go and locate those resources, or at least help the teacher to identify where he or she would find those resources. If we were going to do a token system, maybe we would work with the teacher in terms of putting any materials together that are related to that token or point system. If there's skills that need to be trained, if, for example, this is Anna's first experience with, let's say, a token system or point system, if that was the direction we went in, then myself as the consultant would work with her to make sure she had those skills. And we'll talk actually about that in a little more detail in another slide or two. So that's preparing for the intervention. Once we have that done, now we have to implement it. And your role as a consultant is primarily to make sure that the treatment is implemented as designed. And we talked about this yesterday, that adherence can be really sketchy at best in some cases. And so how are you going to monitor that? How are you going to make sure that the intervention has been implemented as intended? Of course, the best way to find that out is to go and watch it and see if the intervention's been implemented. You may have limited time, however, where you're not able to do that, and so maybe there are other methods where the consultee completes a checklist that she followed the right steps, or there are permanent products of the intervention that give you some idea of whether the intervention has been used. For example, a daily report card or even a point system with a chart. If that chart is completed, that gives you an indication that something has been done. Granted, people can fabricate that stuff or fake it, but we have to trust our consultees in terms of that, and so we're getting information in some way in terms of that it's being implemented. And part of that too is not only visiting maybe the classroom if you can, but at least checking in some way. Email, phone, text, tweet, whatever the mechanism of contact. You have some contact, checking in. Have you implemented the plan? Have you run into any issues, questions, challenges? Do we need to talk about it? That kind of thing. And then, of course, eventually, if there are problems that come up right away, you're revising the procedures as necessary. But eventually, we get to the point where we're going to evaluate treatment. I should mention that there are various ways. If you have to actually train the teachers in implementing a particular strategy, there's a number of different ways that you can do that, as listed here on this slide. Just telling them what to do, that's didactic. Modeling, obviously, is you maybe coming into the class and showing them what needs to be done. Separately with them, if they want to role play and try it out with you so you can get some feedback. Or maybe you're in the class and you cue them to do certain things at different time. And then ultimately reinforcement, although usually as a consultant we're not in the role of reinforcing teachers, other than socially, in terms of social reinforcement of we appreciate the efforts and you're doing a great job and all that kind of stuff, but not in terms of tangible reinforcement. Typically are we in a position to be doing that. So treatment evaluation, what are we going to be doing at this stage? Well, we've got, let's go back to our example with Anna and Amy as the client. She's collecting data on intervention over a couple of weeks. And after those couple of weeks, we want to go back and look at the data in terms of, remember that we revised our goal to, was it 5? 5 instead of 3. So what we would want to do is we would talk to the consultee about whether that gap has shrunk. So again, remember, we're going back to the idea that the problem is the gap. The problem is the gap. And so are we getting more congruence between where we want the behavior to be and where it is? Okay, in other words, we're lessening that gap. And so we would look at the data to determine whether that's happening. Are we moving the behavior down closer to congruence with our goal? Okay, and then also, we're looking at, has the plan been effective? Now, that may sound like it's the same thing, but it isn't necessarily, because plan effectiveness has to do with the overall pattern of the behavior, or the overall pattern of the data across time, so that are we getting not only on average down to the 5 level, but what about the variability of the behavior? Is there consistency in what we're finding? Are we still seeing the patterns that we saw before, and maybe some days it's not working all that well, so it's not completely effective. So we're looking at patterns, and we're looking at distractions outside the room, and we're looking at whether there in particular is not only a change in level where we're bringing the 10 down to 5, but is the overall trend in the right direction? Are we going in a downward fashion here, or is it really variable? So we're looking at that overall pattern of data. And what we're interested in then using that data to do is to make decisions about what do we do next. What are our alternatives in terms of where we go from here? Post-implementation is the phase we're in. And so there's a number of different alternatives. One is we could keep the plan in place as is. It seems to be working pretty well. We haven't completely met our goal yet, so we need to continue the plan. Another possibility is we've made partial progress towards the goal, but we're not completely there yet, and maybe we need to make adjustments to increase the value of the reinforcer or to change the frequency with which the teacher provides praise, or we make some adjustments to the plan. We don't scrap it, but we make some adjustments to it. The other possibility is we're not getting anywhere, and it's been implemented, but we're not getting anywhere, and so we need to go back to the problem analysis phase to revisit. Maybe we were off target. Maybe we didn't really identify the triggers or consequences accurately, or maybe we hit on a strategy that didn't really tie those triggers and consequences in as good as they could have been. So we'd go back to the problem analysis phase. So we're using the data to determine where we're going next in terms of our post-implementation plan. Regardless of what that decision is, we need to continue to periodically collect some data to see if our plan works over time, and also to allow for the consultee to come back if the problem recurs. So at some point, maybe the problem's going to come back, particularly if she abandons those strategies for working with Amy. Maybe the problem recurs and we'll have to deal with it. And what you want to do as a consultant is kind of predict the future a little bit and say, it's possible that somewhere down the line this problem is going to come back, in which case, A, you can get back in touch with me and we can revisit what we're doing. Or B, maybe you want to plan ahead. What would you do if this problem behavior returns? What would you do next? And so get them to think proactively, preventively in that regard. The other thing that we might do is just, we could be looking at our data look beautiful, but she doesn't like the plan for whatever reason. She feels like it's taken up too much of her time, or it's not feasible to do on a regular basis. So we need to tap into acceptability. Hopefully you get some ideas here in terms of some things to think about through a problem-solving process. And most importantly, in ways to think about this as a collaborative exercise between you and the consultee, that you have joint ownership of what's happening, and that the consultee plays a strong role in determining what's happening. There are two variants of consultative problem solving I want to mention to you. One is conjoint behavioral consultation. I'll give you a little bit of information about that now. That's where we engage parents and teachers conjointly. That's where that word comes from. Conjoint behavioral consultation is parents and teachers together as consultees working with you. And then consultative problem solving to develop academic interventions. We actually talked a little bit about this at the end of yesterday. Those of you who were here yesterday, which is I think most of you, we talked about that database decision-making model. That's really what this second bullet is referring to. So let me focus on conjoint behavioral consultation. This is where we're extending consultative problem solving to joint consultees, so teachers and parents working together. Why would we do this? Well, we want to promote successful outcomes. That should say through joint, not join. Joint mutual cross-system planning. So we have multiple systems involved. A lot of our kids are having problems across those systems, as we've all alluded to over the last 2 days. So maybe one way to do that is to mutually come together to identify problems and maybe attack them in a similar way at home and at school. So the other objective here, the second goal, is to promote parent engagement. We've talked a couple of times over the last couple of days about the challenges with getting parents engaged. Well, conjoint behavioral consultation may be one way to build that engagement. And we're trying to do that in a developmental, culturally sensitive way. And then ultimately, we want to establish and strengthen home-school partnerships, trying to work together. And a lot of times, as I'm sure you're aware, we're at odds between home and school. And conjoint behavioral consultation may be a way to try to overcome those conflicts and as a way to try to build mutual collaboration. What are we doing in terms of what are our objectives in this model, this CBC, Conjoint Behavioral Consultation model? We want to get more comprehensive data. If we can get comprehensive data across time and different settings, that might give us some clues as to triggers and consequences that we wouldn't have gotten from just one setting. Secondly, hopefully we can establish a consistent intervention across settings. That may build better outcomes in both settings. Now, that's not always possible to do the same thing at home as you're doing at school and vice versa, but some of the same principles could be applied. So, for example, if we know that we need to have a motivational system in place in both places, maybe the specifics of the motivational system is a little different at school and home, but we have some of the same principles and same targets in terms of outcomes in both places. So we're building consistency. Hopefully we're improving skills, knowledge, and behavior of all involved. We're monitoring side effects across settings. It could be that it works well in one setting but not in another. We can pick up on that. And this is all about building generalization. So if we get some good effects at school, maybe we're going to also get some good effects at home and vice versa, or across generalization across settings. Hopefully we're improving communication. We're building shared ownership. With more information from both parents and teachers, maybe we have more of an opportunity to really conceptualize what's going on. Maybe that helps people to take different perspectives. Maybe that helps the teacher to take the parent's perspective and vice versa as we jointly talk about a problem. Maybe that we can build more empathy, if you will, and perspective take, shared perspective taking in that process. Hopefully we're strengthening relationships across systems, maximizing opportunities to address those needs. We're hopefully building towards a shared commitment towards the goals and increasing the diversity of expertise. Now we're bringing the parent into the equation, and the parent is the expert on the kid. Let's face it, that the parent is in the best position to know that child's history, to know that child's development, and other things other factors that may be important for us to consider. So here's the good news, is that conjoint behavioral consultation, the stages are almost identical to the consultative problem-solving model. They're just given different labels. So instead of problem identification as the first phase, we call it conjoint needs identification. It gets a little complicated here because you're trying to identify problems in two settings from the perspective of two people, and they may not agree right away on what the problem is. And so the needs that the parent perceives may be different from what the teacher perceives, and so we need to prioritize. We need to think about, all right, where are the commonalities and where are the priorities? And, obviously it also requires a little more effort to operationalize what the concerns are, to put them in terms that are clear and behavioral and objective. And then we need to ask data collection in both settings, which, obviously can be a challenge, but that's critical. We need data from both settings in terms of what's actually happening at home and at school. That then leads into the problem analysis. We call this conjoint needs analysis, where we're looking at conditions and functional information, and then developing intervention plans collaboratively, as we did with the problem analysis interview. But now we have multiple collaborators. We have parent, teacher, consultant. Now it expands a little bit in terms of the ideas. You as a consultant, though, are still trying to bring to the table expertise about behavior change strategies at a general level that need to be applied in a given situation, and you're collaboratively working with parents and teachers to identify the specifics of that. and how that will play out at home versus school. Plan and implementation is as I've described for conjoint behavioral consultation, and then conjoint plan evaluation. You're looking at data to determine whether the intervention's working. Social validity here is referring to acceptability. Does both the parent and the teacher find the intervention acceptable? Is it feasible from both of their perspectives? It can get complicated, obviously, especially if one thinks it is and the other doesn't. And you have to work out the differences. And then planning for maintenance. So where do we go from here? What are some problems we can anticipate? What are some challenges down the road that we can anticipate? Do we meet again in a month or two for a booster session? Where do we go next in terms of building on the gains that hopefully we've made? Now I have this website that I wanted to show you really quickly. Okay, so this website is at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. The reason for that is that it is Susan Sheridan, who's a professor there in educational psychology. She's the developer of this conjoint behavioral consultation model. And so she has a really nice website that I've given you the link to. There's a description of conjoint behavioral consultation, and if you look over to the right side of the page, you can click on PowerPoint presentations that she and her group have done in terms of an introduction to CBC, what are the stages, how do you deal with resistance or barriers in the context of this consultation model, what are some behavior management strategies that could be used in the context of CBC, how to build relationships in the context of conjoint behavioral consultation. So you can click on those and download those PowerPoint presentations. The other thing that's on here is, I'll skip over the student presentations, you can certainly look at those, but there's also forms that can be used as part of conjoint behavioral consultation that you can download. They're in PDF form. So outlines of the different interviews. So in the actual problem identification interview, problem analysis interview, various other forms that can be completed by parents or teachers, checklists. So all kinds of things that would be helpful, materials that would be helpful if you want to implement this model in pretty scripted fashion. And those are all available for download for free. Questions on conjoint behavioral consultation? Has anybody actually tried that, working with parents and teachers together to try to develop plans? You're nodding yes, yes. How does this model relate to what you've attempted to do with it?
It's similar. I was in a non-school-based day treatment program. So a lot of the parents were willing to come in and it was kind of part of. So we had a good relationship with a lot of parents.
So there was more of a structured engagement that was already in place, yeah. So that certainly would facilitate this kind of model. In a similar circumstance? Or?
In the elementary school, whenever we have, our EBD students displaying certain behaviors, we want to find out if the behavior is similar at home. So we like to bring in the parents to find out what is going on at home. And most of the time, we just, consistency during the day, but then at home, they're not doing anything, and, we need to bring them on board. It's like what we're doing in the morning, it gets destroyed in the afternoon, and we feel like we're starting all over again every day.
Right. So you're trying to build the consistency across settings in terms of intervention, and that's a big piece of what's being attempted here with conjoint behavioral consultation. The thing about this is it structures collaboration, it tries to structure partnership, and it does get complicated, there's no question. Three can become a crowd pretty quickly. That old saying, two's company, three's a crowd. It's a little more difficult to manage, there's no doubt about it, but if you can follow that structure and the family can get engaged with the process, it can really go a long way towards building that consistency across settings, which is often a real key goal for many of the kids we work with. As I said to you, I'm going to skip over the consultative problem solving to develop academic interventions, because we talked about this a little bit yesterday. But I do have the references here for you, a couple of papers that came out of our research team up at Lehigh on this model. And those are on your resource list. So if you want to get more information, on that. You can certainly look at those, or I've also provided my email address on the first or the second slide. So let me go to the last thing I want to talk about before we quit is kind of process issues about consultation. Again, I've kind of emphasized, and I just want to emphasize again as we're closing out, that consultation really is a collaborative process. It really has to be seen as a mutually respectful partnership where each person in that partnership brings expertise to the table. Each partner brings expertise to the table. It may be hopefully complementary expertise. There's not necessarily overlap, but it's complementary and mutually respected. There is reciprocal influence. It's a two-way interaction where you as a consultant will lead at certain stages of the process, and then other parts of the process the consultee would lead. And so what we're shooting for is a balance between leading and following. We're not solely in the expert mode, always being the leader. We have to also follow the lead of the consultee at certain stages. So for example, some of the data that have been collected on this model in schools have found that during the PII stage, teachers often are taking the lead. And that is associated with better outcomes if we allow that to happen. Now, I don't mean in terms of taking the lead in terms of asking the questions, but taking the lead in terms of providing the information and identifying the problem. You know, ultimately, it's the teacher that needs to identify the problem. And so we may guide that process, but the teacher really has to take the lead on that. Alternatively, when we get to the problem analysis stage, especially treatment design stage, the consultant taking the lead is associated with positive outcomes. And in particular, suggesting a general plan strategy that's likely to be effective. I mean, that's really key, obviously, is to come up with a general plan that is tied to the function, tied to the data, that has a reasonable chance of succeeding, as opposed to the teacher making that general suggestion. Not to say that teachers couldn't do that accurately and effectively, but overall, that's what we are supposed to be bringing to the table. And to the extent that we're bringing those effective interventions to the table, not surprisingly, positive outcomes occur. So it's really a balance of reciprocal influence, and it really depends on the stage of the process that we're in terms of who's taking the lead and who's following. And so ultimately, it's got to be that kind of reciprocal collaboration. That is presumed to be better in terms of acceptability and outcomes than a one-way, top-down expert consultation model where we simply prescribe the strategy, tell them what to do, and good luck, see you later. So to kind of sum up what we've talked about is again the need for collaboration in designing interventions rather than simply prescribing those strategies through an expert consultation model. We need to be looking at collaborative. And one possibility, it's one model that's out there. I'm not saying it's the perfect model or it's the only way to do it, but the consultative problem-solving model has some good data behind it, has been used for several decades pretty successfully as a process to develop interventions collaboratively with teachers. And there are variations of that. If you want to bring parents into the equation, there's the Conjoint behavioral consultation model. If you want to deal with a different area of concern, let's say academic concerns rather than behavior, there are variations of this problem-solving model that can be used for academic outcomes. Okay, well, thank you for your interest, and good luck to all of you. Hopefully this has been helpful to you.